Which leads me to the next question. How do you measure the success of these infographics?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. If you can solve this one, you're a better man than I am. I'm not sure what you're going to say about domain authority, but when you try to get business leaders, CEOs, marketing people, PR people, SEO people, like everybody on the same page, how do you measure the result of all the different places, let's say, that have mentioned you and linked to you? There aren't a lot of good ways to do this. So you could try to estimate the traffic of the site. You could try to, if you had insights as to how much juice that particular site or link was bringing you, if they had public stats on how many views something was, that's one thing. But I would say we're looking at the quality and the quantity of the links that we were able to get. And there's an interesting tool. I don't know if you've ever heard of CoverageBook. No. CoverageBook is a pretty interesting take on kind of, I'm obsessed with not just SEO or not just PR or not just content, but how it all comes together. How do all these worlds communicate to regular people? Because if they were great at all this stuff, what would they be hiring all of us for, right? So this is an interesting tool that's synthesizing a bunch of different metrics and links and traffic. So it'll look at average domain authority, it'll try to measure the estimated traffic of a site, and then it'll try to estimate the traffic of a particular piece that was run on a site. So this is just aggregating everything. And it's been pretty cool so far. I feel like a lot of people have been happy since we switched to that probably about a year or two ago.
Do you think it's primarily, so it's not just about links, although that seems like a big component of it in terms of what you're measuring. But you're also measuring potential traffic from...
Potential traffic, social proof, all that, yeah.
Have you used there's also like, I guess the goal is, for my goal when I wanted to hire you was not necessarily for the traffic, it's just for the awareness for that product to get out in other areas that I might not be looking for.
Right.
And primarily maybe get in the press.
Right.
By giving the press something they can consume in a very quick snapshot.
Right, and that's where DA lies, right? So there are people that just over-engineer the SEO on a site to have a huge domain authority, and then there's like no fundamentals on the site. There's barely any traffic. So that's why I'm saying the quantity and the quality. So we're always going to try for the biggest and brightest in the press, and the press is a very interesting animal. They have certain things that they like over other things. Some places like to have the exclusive, for instance. Other places could care less about what's an exclusive. We're a big site. What do we care about that? Some places could love things, and some places could run it and never tell you about it. It's so kind of random. So I also have a little bit of a journalist hat on, and I see some of the horrible pitches that people pitch me all day and night by the hour. So
for sure. Yeah, I mean, it seems like you've written out many publications over the past. So you have that experience, you know what people like. Well, that has changed over the years. It used to be a lot easier to get press mentions than it is today.
Right. Well, there's an interesting thing going on in the media. I think the world of journalism is, I'm not going to say is on the verge of collapse, because we're not that doom and gloom, even though we started the show with all sorts of political divisiveness. But they have a problem. So let's say you have something like the Huffington Post, and then it gets gobbled up by BuzzFeed, and then a couple weeks later, 75% of the staff get axed. How does a site run with 25% of the journalists? Well, it's people like us, I think, that help give them things that maybe their staff aren't producing. So a newsroom knows they might not have a full data science department and all this crazy stuff that we're doing. So if we say, hey, we've been sending you stuff for the last decade, and you don't like all of it, but you like some of it. So you're aware of who we are and you're aware of the quality. So we can at least get through the front door that a lot of other people aren't doing. And then I think that's a reason why it still works, because we've been there a while and people know who we are.
Okay. Rand Fishman has this tool called Sparktoro, right? Mm-hmm. That might also, they measure that type of stuff across social media. Mm-hmm. So that might be also useful.
That could be cool.
But in any event, it's interesting. It's interesting how you measure it. Do you have dashboards or anything like that for clients, or they log into, or not really? It's more like hands.
So it's more like that tool that I had mentioned before. Okay. I think that covers a lot of what they're looking for.
Okay.
But some people, it just depends on the client, and it depends on, honestly, sometimes the department of the client. So some people will want some of the nuts and bolts, CSVs and whatever, to put into their own system. It just kind of depends on, because we work with so many different walks of life. Yeah.
Right. Would you want to mention maybe one dream best infographic you had historically, or maybe make up some fictitious one?
Well, the basketball one sure was good.
Okay.
For the SEO community, I'm sure you know Steve Wiedemann. Yeah. We just did a piece for him, which I'm always surprised by just all the different ways that people get into using what we do. So what I liked about what Steve and the team did, they had a whole research compendium to go along with the infographic. So their specialty is multi-location, local SEO, right, for different franchises, whatever, if you have multiple locations. So that was a really good implementation and use of the infographic. So a lot of like the more local SEO and critical SEO crowd really liked it. But then it also went further and wider into different audiences because not everybody's an SEO that needs that. They need the SEO help. So it just helped people understand it in an interesting way. There was a really cool piece that's almost a decade old. I like this one because for everybody who's kind of on the SEM side, people forget that if you turn off that water faucet, they're not going to run anything because it doesn't. I guess some social ads might have some extra lift in virality, but a lot of times it's just some kind of, you pay the money, it shows up, pretty standard. What was interesting about this, it rewires the way that you're kind of thinking about stuff as you're going around on the internet, because people aren't reading when they're on the internet, right? Jacob Nielsen, probably 20 or 30 years ago, said that people don't read on the internet. They do something called chunking. So their brain is looking for all these different stop patterns, and that's what the power of some of these visuals do. So there was a piece for a painting company called The Psychology of Color. What was cool about this was you'd click around on the internet, your favorite social site, blog, news site, whatever, and you'd say, wow, this is really colorful. I don't know a lot about color psychology and interior design. And then you'd read through and you'd say, oh wow, the Pantone Institute says that blue is the most productive office color. And it gives people a little bit of an education. It doesn't make them experts on the fly, nothing does that. But it gives people enough helpful educational content that they say, I'm gonna share this, I'm gonna save this, I'm gonna print this out, and I'm literally gonna buy from this place because they bothered to educate me instead of sell me on something. So I feel like that was one that was really interesting.
Interesting.
And just holds the
time.
No,
I mean, that's at Search Engine Atlanta, we have obviously our SEO periodic table.
Sure, I remember that one. That was great.
That's an infographic. Yeah. So it was basically putting a lot of knowledge into that. Always causes controversy because you can't really get everything in SEO into one infographic.
Yeah, deal with it, people. I mean, that's
but
why
it
it's the internet.
And we update it every couple of years.
Right.
And that works pretty well. And sometimes we gate it, which basically means, if you know what gating is basically you have to put an email address in to download it. Sometimes we don't gate it. It depends on, I don't know, who's in charge at that time.
I've seen different models of it. So honestly, it's going to depend on the overall structure of who's doing it. So there are some, let's say it's like a trade publication that hired us. They would probably form gate it or registration gate it. So it's certainly valid. I find that kind of frustrating because you just want to see the thing. So it's a little bit of an impulse. You don't want to lose people. Kind of like a lot of these sites these days, you're just clicking around one day and you're like, oh, I have to pay to be on this site? And a lot of people, they just don't want to. They'll spend $1,000 on a phone, but they won't spend $5 for their favorite publication. I mean, that's just people, I guess. But,
Right. I mean, content isn't free. People think it's free, but it's not. And
not at all, right.
A lot of news publications are now requiring you to pay to see their subscription. You get 3 clicks for free.
Right.
And then people like us know if you use certain types of methods, you get around it. But in terms of the gating, I mean, it depends on your goal. Obviously, if you want to get it out to as many people, some people even do a mixture. It's like they'll show the first, like infographic could be numerous pages. It could be a 40-page document.
Sure.
So it could be.
Let's hope not, because it's supposed to kind of reduce things down.
Right. But then maybe the infographic, the actual splash screen tells you the summary of everything that's going on, and then in detail you have all the research behind it, all the broken out details around it, and so forth. So,
about a decade ago or so, I think we coined this term. I didn't see it before we did it. We called it the infographic white paper because there was a particular client that wanted a white paper, and it was ridiculously long. And who's going to read a 50 to 100-page white paper? And we were going to do an infographic, and they said, that's just not going to get it done because it's kind of a page. It could be a really long page with a long scroll, to your point. But I think that there's a sweet spot that, especially in B2B and cyber and different things like that, people have a lot of stuff to say, and it might not fit in a page. So sometimes there's this magic sweet spot of, let's say, 10 pages or so that you could make it look like an infographic, but it still has some of the depth of the white paper. So that's kind of
right. I'm thinking in my head, the SEO periodic table, we have everything in the periodic table, and each element has its own page also.
Yeah, there you go. Right.
Which that could be like a 30-page document, but it's still very infographic throughout the whole thing. And you don't have to read the whole thing to get it. You can get a snapshot of the first page.
Right.
And so forth. Is there any put you on the spot, the worst infographic you ever seen or you ever had to make because a client forced you to?